Hi, my name is Debra R. Richardson of Debra R. Richardson LLC, and I help you clean up your vendor data, clean up your vendor processes so that you pay the right vendor. Now, this week's vendor master file tip of the week is not the best practices when changing your vendor's banking. It is the bad practices when changing your vendor's banking. So let's get started. I think I have 5. All right, so bad practices when changing your vendor's banking. The first one is not making sure or authenticating the requester that is submitting the change. Now, that is whether the requester is your internal team member, if they're going to submit the request on behalf of the vendor, or of the vendor themselves. And what you want to do is you want to make sure that it is your actual real vendor, that it is your actual internal team member that is submitting that request. And the way that you authenticate is just like your bank does. When you call them, they will ask you 2 to 3 authenticating questions, and if you answer correctly, then they will discuss whatever you contacted them about. And so you need to do the same thing with your vendors and with your internal team members. And chances are that if you push back on that initial request, and they really are a fraudster, they will just hang up. Now, the second bad practice is not requiring authentication on the bank form. So let's say you did authenticate your vendor. You know you are communicating with your actual vendor. Send them your own company branded ACH form. And when you send that form, add on the form or include on your standard template, your standard form, authenticating data, including their existing banking. And if they push back and don't have existing banking, then you have to wonder that if they don't have existing banking, how do they have the authority or the access to change the banking? So ask for authenticating data. You can also include things like their tax ID, maybe a remittance address, a vendor ID, things that will help you make sure you update the right vendor. The next one is changing banking based on an invoice. That's always a bad idea. Number one, you're not authenticating where you got the invoice from because that invoice has already been submitted. So that could have been submitted by a fraudster. And number two, again, you want to make sure you have authenticating data before you change it. And you want to make sure that at least one of those elements of authenticating data is the existing banking. And if you just change it based on the new banking on the invoice, then you will not have the existing banking to verify it or authenticate it against. So you don't want to change banking based on an invoice. Plus, it's hard to find, it's hard to identify when a bank changes on an invoice, especially if you have, and you should, a separate team member that is maintaining the vendor master file from the team member or members that are posting invoices. They can't tell just by looking at it that it is a new bank account. Now, number 4 is not validating the bank branch details. Banks merge and get acquired all the time. One example I use all the time is SunTrust and BB&T. They merged or were acquired or merged with together, and now they are Truist. So if you think about all the vendors that still have the BB&T and SunTrust routing numbers, you got to update them all. And vendors never really pay attention to that unless it really affects them. If they're keeping the same bank account number, just the routing number is going to change, they probably won't get new checks. And so they're going to give you that same banking or vendor letterhead that they've always given with that old routing number. They're going to give you that same voided check that has that same routing number on it because they're not going to go and get new checks. And so you do want to make sure that you verify that the bank branch details are correct. And if any of you are using SAP, you know how bad that bank table can be. So make sure you check that before you update it. Now, the next thing is, or the last one, number 5, is not sending a notification to the vendor after the change. So you want to make sure that just the way your bank, since I used that earlier, if you make a change to your profile, your registration on your bank site or Amazon site or Hulu or Netflix, they always send you some type of a communication either by email or by mail or both to say, hey, your account has been changed. If you did not initiate the change, either contact us or change your password or something to that effect. And you need to do the same thing with your vendors. So if there is a change to banking, make sure you follow all of these, you follow the best practices, the opposite of what I added here, and then you also send that notification to the vendor to let them know, because you never know if they are checking their email, they just may be able to notify you before you make that fraudulent payment, especially if your pay cycles are weekly. Now, you might notice that I did not say anything about that phone call. And I know the phone call is there, and I know that you should make it, or that it can be part of a fraud risk process. And if you are going to make it and it's still required, make sure you document it, because guess what? The vendors are not sitting around, waiting on that authenticating or that confirmation phone call. If you look at the picture here, she's smiling because she tried to contact that vendor multiple times and she finally got him on the phone. The vendors give you their information and then they're off doing vendor things. And so that phone call might be able to be avoided. I've had a couple of clients that were able to replace that phone call with authentication of the requester and authentication of the data. All right, so if you'd like more information on how to improve your vendor process, please go to my website at debrarrichardson.com for free tools and resources to avoid fraud, regulatory fines, and just overall bad vendor data. So good luck, and subscribe and hit the notification bell to be notified next Tuesday for the next Vendor Master File tip of the week.